Chapter 1. The day I realized time didn't wait. The reminder disappeared from my phone at exactly 9:14 p.m. Just a soft vibration, a brief glow on the screen, then nothing. No balloons, no candles, no crowd singing off-key. Just a notification sliding away like it had never mattered. I stared at the blank screen longer than I should have, my thumb hovering where the reminder used to be. Birthday, it had said. No exclamation mark, no emojis, just a word and a date, treated with the same quiet efficiency as a dentist appointment or a grocery list item. I locked the phone and set it face down on the table. The apartment was quiet, not the peaceful kind of quiet, just the absence of noise. The refrigerator hummed softly. A car passed outside, tires whispering against a street. Somewhere, a neighbor laughed. The sound drifted in and faded quickly, like it didn't belong to me. I sat alone at the small kitchen table with a half-finished cup of tea that had already gone cold. I wasn't sad. That was the strange part. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel angry. I didn't even feel disappointed. There was no dramatic emotion to explain why my chest felt tight. There was only stillness. And inside that stillness, something uncomfortable began to surface. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the room. Everything was familiar. Everything was in its place. The same chair I always sat in, the same table, the same view out the window where the city lights blinked on and off like they had done every night before. Nothing was wrong, and yet, something felt deeply off. I thought about the number attached to my birthday. It didn't shock me. I wasn't afraid of getting older. I didn't feel panic about wrinkles or milestones or what society expected by a certain age. What unsettled me wasn't age, it was time. Not the kind that passes visibly marked by calendars and candles, but the kind that slips through your fingers quietly while you're busy being responsible. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last birthday that had felt different, one where I had felt present, alive, not because something special happened, but because I was fully there for it. The memory didn't come easily. Instead, my mind drifted through years like a slow pan across empty rooms. I saw myself saying later to things that mattered. I saw myself postponing decisions, conversations, risks. I saw myself waiting for clarity, for confidence, for the right moment. Waiting became my default. I told myself I was being practical, thoughtful, patient. But sitting there on my birthday night, I wondered when patience had turned into avoidance. The tea sat untouched in front of me. I lifted the mug and took a sip, grimacing slightly at the cold bitterness. I should have reheated it. I didn't. That small choice felt symbolic in a way I couldn't ignore. I had grown used to accepting things as they were, even when they no longer satisfied me. I stood up and walked to the window. The glass reflected my face faintly, layered over the city lights behind me. For a moment, I studied that reflection like it belonged to someone else. I looked fine, healthy, capable, put together. There were no visible signs of collapse, no crisis to point to, no dramatic reason to explain why my stomach felt heavy. But as I stared at my reflection, a thought surfaced slowly, fully formed and impossible to dismiss. I wasn't afraid of getting older. I was afraid of how much I had postponed. The realization landed quietly, but it changed the temperature of the room. I thought about all the things I had delayed because they didn't feel urgent. The dreams that were always scheduled for a future version of myself, one who would be braver, clearer, more ready. I thought about how often I had told myself, not now, soon. Soon became months. Months became years. And years passed without resistance because nothing forced me to stop waiting. There was no alarm, no warning, just time doing what time does best, moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I sat back down at the table and rested my elbows on the surface, pressing my palms together. My breathing felt shallow, controlled, like I was trying not to disturb something fragile. I asked myself a question I had avoided for a long time. What exactly was I waiting for? The answer didn't come right away. That frightened me more than any number on a birthday ever could. I had built my life around stability, around making sensible choices, around minimizing risk. And from the outside, it had worked. Everything functioned, everything looked fine. But inside, I felt like I was living in a pause I had forgotten to unpause. The unease grew, not sharp, not dramatic, but persistent. I realized then that waiting wasn't neutral. It wasn't harmless. Waiting had been quietly shaping my life, one postponed decision at a time. It had made me comfortable with delay, comfortable with settling, comfortable with not choosing. And the most unsettling part was how reasonable it all seemed. I wasn't reckless, I wasn't irresponsible, I hadn't failed in any obvious way. I had simply waited. I waited for certainty before acting. I waited for permission before wanting. I waited for a future that kept moving further away. The room felt smaller now, not claustrophobic, just intimate, like it was holding me still so I couldn't escape the thought. Time doesn't announce itself when it leaves, I realized. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't make noise. It just goes. And on that quiet birthday night, with a reminder already gone from my phone, I understood something I had never fully faced before. Time hadn't waited for me. I had been waiting for it. The realization didn't come with panic. It came with a deep, unsettling calm, the kind that follows truth when it finally settles in your body. I wasn't broken. I wasn't behind, but I was delayed. And for the first time, that felt like something I needed to confront. Not tomorrow, not soon, but now. I picked up my phone again and unlocked the screen. The date stared back at me indifferent. Another year had passed. I didn't make a wish. I didn't promise myself anything dramatic. I didn't plan a transformation. I just sat there, breathing slowly, letting the unease exist without pushing it away. Because I knew this wasn't sadness. It was awareness. And once awareness arrives, waiting no longer feels harmless. It feels dangerous. That night, on a birthday that looked like any other night, I didn't lose anything, but I saw clearly, for the first time, what waiting had already taken. And I knew, quietly, unmistakably, that I couldn't afford to keep letting time move forward without me anymore. Chapter 2. Waiting for the right moment. My life was built on 2 words: not yet. They slipped into my thoughts so naturally that I barely noticed them anymore. Not yet when an idea surfaced. Not yet when a desire felt inconvenient. Not yet when something inside me stirred and asked to be taken seriously. Not yet sounded responsible, mature, careful. It sounded like the opposite of recklessness. From the outside, my life made sense. I had done what I was supposed to do. I showed up. I met expectations. I handled things when they needed handling. People trusted me because I didn't rush. I didn't panic. I didn't make impulsive decisions. I waited. I waited for confidence to arrive before speaking up. I waited for stability before making changes. I waited for permission before wanting more. I waited for someone else to decide so I wouldn't have to. At first, waiting felt like wisdom. Why act before you're ready? Why move without a plan? Why risk what's working? Those questions followed me everywhere, shaping my choices until hesitation felt like logic. When I didn't apply for something I wanted, I told myself I needed more experience. When I stayed silent instead of sharing an opinion, I told myself it wasn't the right time. When I ignored a feeling that made me uncomfortable, I told myself I was being practical. Waiting became my shield. It protected me from embarrassment, from rejection, from regret, or so I believed. Days passed smoothly, predictably. I moved through routines with ease. Wake up, work, respond, repeat. I knew what was expected of me, and I delivered it consistently. People described my life with words like steady and solid. They said I was doing well, that I had things figured out. I nodded when they said it, even as something inside me drifted further away. The numbness didn't arrive suddenly. It seeped in quietly, filling the spaces where excitement used to live. I stopped anticipating things, stopped imagining different versions of my life. I told myself that was adulthood. You stop dreaming, you start managing. But managing slowly replaced living. I didn't feel unhappy. That was the confusing part. There were no clear complaints I could list, no dramatic dissatisfaction. Everything functioned. That's what made the numbness so hard to explain. I went through days without feeling much of anything. Not sadness, not joy, just a muted neutrality that wrapped around everything. Conversations blurred together. Time passed without leaving impressions. I remember standing in line one afternoon, surrounded by people scrolling on their phones, all of us waiting for our turn. The thought struck me suddenly, sharp and unwelcome. This is what my life feels like. Always waiting, always in line, always almost. The thought scared me, so I pushed it away. I had responsibilities. Waiting wasn't laziness, it was restraint. It was being considerate. It was not causing trouble. Waiting disguised itself as responsibility so well that questioning it felt irresponsible. What if acting too soon ruined things? What if speaking up created problems? What if wanting more made me ungrateful? Those fears kept me still. I noticed how often I deferred decisions to others, how easily I said, "Whatever you think," or "I'm fine either way." It felt polite, cooperative, but over time, it erased my preferences. I stopped asking myself what I wanted because the answer always felt complicated. Wanting meant risking disappointment. It meant acknowledging that something was missing. So I waited instead. Waiting didn't ask anything of me. It let me stay comfortable. I watched people around me make changes, some small, some reckless, some brave. I congratulated them, encouraged them, listened to their stories. Then I went back to my life and told myself my time would come. Someday. The word lingered in my mind like a promise I didn't have to keep yet. Inside, the numbness grew heavier. It wasn't dramatic enough to demand attention, but it was persistent, a low hum of dissatisfaction I couldn't turn off. I tried to distract myself, stay busy, stay useful. Productivity became another form of waiting. As long as I was doing something, I didn't have to confront the stillness. But even busyness lost its effect. There were moments when I caught myself staring at nothing, lost in thoughts, unsure how long I had been gone. Time slipped past me unnoticed, and when I returned, I felt disoriented, as if I had been absent from my own life. I told myself this was normal, that everyone felt this way sometimes, that life wasn't supposed to feel exciting all the time. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. The problem wasn't that life lacked excitement. The problem was that I had put my desires on hold indefinitely. I had convinced myself that waiting was neutral, that it didn't cost anything, that time would remain patient while I prepared. But waiting was costing me something I couldn't measure easily. It was dulling my sense of urgency, blurring my sense of identity, teaching me to accept less than what felt true. I sat with that realization one evening, the room quiet around me, the familiar sense of unease rising again. Nothing was wrong, and that was the problem. There was no crisis to force change, no breakdown to justify action, just a growing awareness that I was postponing my life while calling it caution. I wondered how many years had passed like this, reasonably, quietly, safely. How many moments I had postponed until they no longer felt reachable. Waiting had given me the illusion of control. In reality, it had slowly taken it away. Because while I waited, time moved on without consulting me, and I began to understand something I had avoided for a long time. The right moment doesn't arrive on its own. It doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come fully formed, wrapped in certainty. The right moment is created, and by allowing it to appear, I had allowed countless moments to pass untouched. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought a deep, uncomfortable clarity. I wasn't stuck because life was complicated. I was stuck because waiting became my identity. And the longer I stayed there, the more numb I became to the possibility of anything else. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the word "not yet" echoed in my mind. For the first time, it didn't sound responsible. It sounded like a warning. Chapter 3. The Dream That Never Left. I found the notebook by accident. It was buried in the back of a closet, hidden behind things I no longer used but couldn't bring myself to throw away. Old cables, a jacket that no longer fit, a box labeled miscellaneous, which usually meant things I don't want to think about yet. The notebook was thinner than I remembered. Its cover was soft, worn at the edges, the color faded from years of neglect. I stood there holding it, my fingers resting on the spine, a strange tension rising in my chest. I knew what it was before I opened it. I hadn't seen it in years, not because I lost it, but because I stopped looking for it. I sat down on the floor and opened the first page slowly, as if moving too fast might erase what was inside. My handwriting stared back at me, familiar, younger, more confident than I felt now. Plans, ideas, sentences that began with "one day" and "I want." Lists that weren't practical, weren't cautious, weren't filtered through responsibility. They were honest. I turned the pages carefully, my breath shallow, my mind drifting backward. Each page carried the voice of someone who believed there was time, someone who assumed movement was inevitable. I remembered how it felt to write those words, the quiet excitement, the certainty that wanting something meant I would eventually go after it. I hadn't failed at any of it. That was the part that hurt the most. There were no crossed-out dreams, no notes admitting defeat, no evidence that I had tried and fallen short. Everything was untouched, perfectly preserved, like a room that had been closed and left exactly as it was. I felt a tightness in my throat, not sadness yet, something heavier. Shame. Shame for how easily I had forgotten. Shame for how casually I had set it aside. Shame for calling it unrealistic when it made me feel alive. I closed the notebook and pressed it against my chest, my arms wrapping around it instinctively. For a moment, I sat there in silence, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The dream hadn't disappeared. It had been waiting. That realization cracked something open inside me. I thought back to all the times I had told myself I would return to it later, when things settled down, when I felt more secure, when life felt less demanding. Later became a habit, and habits are quiet. I remembered conversations where people asked me what I wanted to do, and I gave them acceptable answers instead, practical ones that didn't invite questions. I remembered smiling when I talked about my plans, even though they felt empty, safe. The dream had been inconvenient. It asked too much. It didn't fit neatly into the structure I had built around myself. So I placed it on pause, temporarily, I told myself. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one challenges it. A few days later, something else happened. I was standing in line at a coffee shop when a stranger behind the counter asked me a question, a simple one, casual. "What do you love doing?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth automatically, ready to answer with something neutral, something respectable. But nothing came out. The barista waited, smiling politely. "I mean," they added lightly, "what makes you feel like yourself?" The words landed softly, but they hit something deep. I stood there too long, my silence stretching awkwardly. I felt heat rise to my face, embarrassed by my hesitation. "I'm not sure," I said finally. The words felt foreign, vulnerable. The barista nodded, unfazed. "Yeah," they said, "that happens." I took my coffee and stepped aside, my heart beating faster than it should have. The question followed me home. What do you love doing? I tried to answer it honestly. My mind reached for the notebook, for the pages filled with intention, for the version of me who had once known exactly what that answer was. I sat down at the table, the cup growing cold in my hands, and allowed myself to think about the dream without dismissing it. It felt awkward, uncomfortable, like visiting a place I used to belong to, but hadn't seen in years. The hope I expected didn't come immediately. What came first was grief. Grief for the time that had passed without progress. Grief for the energy I once had. Grief for how gently I had walked away from something that mattered. I realized then that I hadn't been too afraid to try. I had been too afraid to want. Wanting something deeply meant risking disappointment. It meant acknowledging that my current life wasn't enough. It meant stepping out of the safety of waiting. So I told myself I was being realistic, but realism had slowly turned into resignation. Sitting there, the notebook open again in front of me, I said the words out loud for the first time. I didn't fail my dream. I abandoned it politely. The sentence hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Polite abandonment didn't look like giving up. It looked like postponing, like being patient, like telling yourself you were being responsible. It looked reasonable. That was the most painful truth of all. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't careless. I hadn't sabotaged myself dramatically. I had simply stepped aside. The awareness shifted something inside me. The numbness I had been living with cracked just enough to let feeling through. Not hope yet, but regret. Regret without self-pity, without anger. just a clear-eyed understanding of what had happened. I had paused my dream so quietly that even I forgot it was paused. That night, I placed the notebook on my desk instead of returning it to the closet. I didn't open it again. I didn't make plans. I didn't promise myself anything. I just left it there, visible, a reminder that the dream still existed, even if I wasn't sure what to do with it yet. As I turned off the light and lay in bed, my thoughts circled around a new realization, one that unsettled and grounded me at the same time. Dreams don't disappear when ignored, they wait. And waiting doesn't erase them, it only deepens the moment when you finally have to face what you've been avoiding. For the first time in a long while, the numbness receded just enough for awareness to take its place. And awareness, I was beginning to understand, was the first crack in the life I had built on waiting.
Chapter 4. The Cost of Playing It Safe. I used to believe safety was a virtue. Not recklessness, not impulsiveness. Safety. The careful choice, the predictable path, the decision that caused the least disruption and required the least explanation. I had chosen it so many times that it felt like part of my character. When opportunities appeared that carried even a hint of uncertainty, I weighed them carefully, too carefully. I examined every possible outcome, every potential risk, until the decision lost its shape and urgency. Then I chose what I always chose: stability. I told myself I was being mature, responsible, thoughtful. Other people made bold moves. I admired them quietly from a distance, offering encouragement and praise. I told myself I was different, that I valued consistency over excitement, that not everyone needed to chase something new. But over time, that story stopped feeling true. I noticed how often I chose predictability, even when it cost me something I couldn't name. I stayed where I was because it was familiar, not because it felt right. I repeated routines that no longer challenged me. I accepted limits that weren't imposed by anyone else. Safety became my default answer. I avoided risk not because I had assessed it carefully, but because it made me uncomfortable. And instead of admitting that discomfort, I wrapped it in language that made it sound like wisdom. It's not practical. It's not the right time. I have too much to lose. Those phrases protected me from having to admit the truth. I was afraid of making the wrong choice, afraid of failing publicly, afraid of discovering that I wasn't as capable as I hoped. So I chose what I knew I could handle. At first, it worked. My life stayed calm, orderly, predictable. I knew what my days would look like before they began. I knew what was expected of me, and I met those expectations consistently. People trusted me because I didn't surprise them. I trusted myself because I didn't push. But safety has a cost. It doesn't demand payment up front. It charges quietly, over time, in small emotional installments that are easy to ignore. I started noticing it when I watched others move forward. Friends made changes, took chances, shifted directions. Some failed, some succeeded. All of them moved. I stayed where I was, clapping from the sidelines. At first, I felt proud of them, happy for their courage, relieved that I wasn't the one taking the risk. Then something else crept in, a subtle irritation, a quiet resentment I didn't want to admit. I would listen to their stories, new challenges, unexpected turns, moments of fear and excitement, and feel something twist inside me. Not jealousy exactly, longing. I told myself I was content, that their choices weren't for me, that I preferred peace to uncertainty. But the bitterness didn't disappear. It grew sharper when they spoke of growth, about learning from mistakes, about discovering things they didn't know they were capable of. I realized then that what bothered me wasn't their success. It was their movement. They were accumulating experiences, good and bad, that I didn't have. They were collecting stories, lessons, proof that they were alive in their own lives. I was accumulating stability. And stability, I was learning, doesn't feed the soul. I felt guilty for wanting more. My life wasn't bad. I had reasons to be grateful. Complaining felt inappropriate, ungrateful, indulgent. I told myself I should be satisfied. That guilt kept me quiet. It told me wanting more meant I didn't appreciate what I had, that dissatisfaction was a personal flaw rather than a signal. So I swallowed it. I smiled. I nodded. I said all the right things. Inside, the bitterness hardened. I began to resent not only others, but myself. I resented the part of me that wanted something different, that whispered questions I didn't want to answer, that refused to be comforted by safety alone. The inner tension became exhausting. Gratitude sat on one side, bitterness on the other. I was thankful for my stability. I was angry at what it cost me. I felt lucky. I felt trapped. Those contradictions lived side by side, creating a constant low-level strain I couldn't explain to anyone else. I started to understand that playing it safe wasn't neutral. Every time I chose predictability over possibility, I was making a trade, and the cost of that trade wasn't obvious until much later. The cost was curiosity. The cost was energy. The cost was the part of me that once leaned toward growth instead of comfort. I thought about how often I had declined opportunities not because they were wrong, but because they were unfamiliar. How often I had talked myself out of wanting something before it could challenge me. Safety had taught me how to survive, but it hadn't taught me how to expand. And survival, I was realizing, had slowly replaced fulfillment. The emotional debt had been accumulating quietly. Every postponed decision, every unspoken desire, every risk avoided. They stacked up inside me, not as regret yet, but as weight. I felt it most in quiet moments when there was nothing to distract me, when the noise of the day faded and I was left alone with myself. That was when the questions surfaced again and again. Is this all I'm protecting? The answer unsettled me. I wasn't protecting joy. I wasn't protecting growth. I was protecting familiarity. And familiarity, while comforting, had become limiting. I saw now how easily safety disguises itself as maturity, how it convinces you that staying still is a virtue, how it frames avoidance as wisdom. But wisdom, I was learning, isn't about avoiding discomfort. It's about choosing what matters, even when it's uncomfortable. That realization didn't push me into action immediately. It didn't inspire a dramatic change. It did something quieter. It exposed the cost. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every safe choice I made after that carried weight. Every time I defaulted to predictability, I felt the debt increase. Not because safety was wrong, but because it had become my only language, and I was tired of speaking it fluently while losing the ability to say anything else. The conflict inside me sharpened not into anger, but into awareness. I could continue playing it safe, or I could begin questioning what safety was costing me. And for the first time, that question felt impossible to ignore.
Chapter 5. The night regret spoke clearly. It was well past midnight when the house finally went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels restful, the kind that presses in on you once there's nothing left to distract you. The lights were off in every room except one. A small lamp cast a dull circle on the wall, barely enough to soften the darkness. I was alone. No messages coming in, no obligations waiting, no one needing anything from me, just time. I sat on the edge of the bed, my feet flat on the floor,
my hands resting loosely in my lap. I hadn't planned to stay awake this late. Sleep simply didn't come. My mind refused to slow down, even when my body begged for rest. The day had been ordinary. Nothing unusual had happened. No difficult conversation, no emotional trigger I could point to. And yet, the weight in my chest felt heavier than it had in a long time. I stared at the wall and listened to the quiet. The ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall sounded louder than it should have. Each second landed with too much clarity. I tried to distract myself. I reached for my phone, scrolled without interest, then set it back down. The screen felt empty, pointless. There was nowhere left to look but inward. That was when regret arrived. Not suddenly, not violently. It settled in slowly, like a truth that had been waiting patiently for me to stop running. Images surfaced without invitation, moments from years ago, decisions that felt small at the time, opportunities I had gently declined, conversations I postponed, risks I avoided because they felt inconvenient or unnecessary. I saw myself choosing comfort over curiosity, safety over possibility, waiting over action. The realization didn't hurt right away. At first, it felt distant, observational, like watching someone else's life unfold. Then it hit. I pressed my palms against my thighs, my fingers digging into the fabric, grounding myself as my breath grew shallow. My chest tightened, not with panic, but with recognition. I hadn't wasted time doing nothing. I had wasted it waiting to feel ready. The sentence formed clearly in my mind, sharp and undeniable. Waiting to feel confident enough. Waiting to feel secure enough. Waiting to feel worthy enough. Ready never arrived. I felt my throat tighten as the truth settled deeper. My eyes burned, but I didn't cry yet. I just sat there, frozen, absorbing the weight of it. I had spent years preparing for a life I never fully stepped into. Not because I was incapable, but because I kept telling myself it wasn't time. I leaned forward and rested my elbows on my knees, my head dropping slightly. The posture felt familiar, like someone carrying something too heavy for too long. My breathing became uneven. The room felt smaller. Regret didn't shout, it whispered. It reminded me of all the times I said soon, all the times I chose later, all the times I believed waiting was neutral. The truth was brutal in its simplicity. Waiting had been a decision, not an accident, not fate, not circumstances. A decision I made again and again because it felt safer than choosing. The first tear fell without warning, landing on the back of my hand. I stared at it as if surprised by its presence. Then another followed, and another. I covered my face, not to hide, but because everything inside me felt too exposed. I cried quietly, not the kind of crying that comes with anger or heartbreak. This was slower, deeper, heavy with understanding. I cried for the years I couldn't get back. I cried for the chances I didn't take. I cried for the version of myself who believed readiness was something that arrived from the outside. My shoulders shook as the realization spread through my body. There had been no dramatic failure, no moment where everything collapsed, just a slow accumulation of hesitation. That was what made it so painful. I couldn't blame anyone else. There was no villain, no injustice, only me standing still while time moved forward. I felt a sharp ache in my chest as another thought surfaced, one I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. What if I kept waiting? What if 5 more years passed the same way? 10? The idea terrified me. Not because of age, because of repetition. I imagined myself sitting in the same place years later, asking the same questions, feeling the same regret, only heavier. The idea made my stomach twist. I wiped my face with trembling hands and forced myself to breathe deeply, in through my nose, out through my mouth. The crying slowed, but the clarity remained. For the first time, regret wasn't something I tried to escape. I let it speak. It told me the truth I had avoided for years, that readiness isn't a feeling you wait for. It's something you build by moving, even when you're uncertain. I had mistaken hesitation for caution, delay for wisdom, but wisdom doesn't ask you to disappear from your own life. I lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling, my eyes swollen and tired. The quiet felt different now, less oppressive, more honest. I didn't feel hopeless, I felt exposed, and exposure, I realized, was the beginning of something else. The regret wasn't there to punish me, it was there to wake me up. I understood now that doing nothing wasn't what had cost me time, waiting had. Waiting for confidence to arrive before acting, waiting for fear to disappear before moving, waiting for a perfect moment that never existed. The realization was painful, but it was also grounding, because if waiting was a choice, then so was stopping. I didn't make any promises that night. I didn't map out a new future. I didn't tell myself everything would change. I simply acknowledged the truth, out loud. I don't want to keep living like this. The words sounded fragile in the quiet room, but they were real. I turned off the lamp and let darkness settle around me completely. My body felt drained, but my mind was strangely calm. The breakdown hadn't been loud, it hadn't been dramatic, but it had to be necessary. Regret had spoken clearly that night, not to destroy me, but to show me what waiting had already taken. And for the first time, I understood that ignoring it would cost me more than listening ever could.
Chapter 6. The question that changed everything. The question didn't come from anyone else. There was no therapist leaning forward, no friend offering advice, no stranger interrupting my thoughts with unexpected wisdom. It came from me. I was standing in the kitchen early one morning, the light barely breaking through the window. The house was quiet, not asleep anymore, but not fully awake either. I held a cup of coffee in both hands, feeling its warmth seep into my palms. My mind was unusually still. That was when the question surfaced, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. If nothing changes, will I still be here in 5 years, waiting? The words settled heavily in my chest. I didn't rush to answer them. I didn't push them away. I stood there, breathing, letting the truth they carried unfold. I imagined 5 years passing exactly as the last ones had, the same routines, the same hesitations, the same careful postponement of anything that felt uncertain. The image was painfully clear. I saw myself, older, yes, but more than that, unchanged, still waiting, still telling myself that the right moment was coming, still convincing myself that delay was wisdom. The thought made my stomach tighten. For the first time, I didn't feel angry at my past self. There was no resentment, no harsh judgment, no urge to punish myself for what I hadn't done. I felt understanding. I had waited because I didn't know another way, because waiting felt safer than risking disappointment, because staying still gave me the illusion of control. I had been doing my best with the tools I had at the time. That realization softened something inside me. I didn't need to blame myself to move forward. I just needed to be honest. I set the cup down and leaned against the counter, closing my eyes briefly. The quiet of the morning felt different now, less empty, more attentive. Waiting wasn't something that had happened to me. It was something I had chosen. Not all at once, not consciously, but repeatedly. And choices, once recognized, can be changed. The thought didn't bring immediate relief. It brought responsibility. Responsibility without cruelty. I understood then that taking ownership didn't mean tearing myself apart. It meant acknowledging my role without excuses and without shame. I had waited for confidence to appear before acting. I had waited for fear to fade before moving. I had waited for certainty before choosing. But those conditions were never required. They were preferences, comforts, safeguards I had placed around myself. The question lingered. If nothing changes, I realized how easily 5 more years could pass unnoticed, how quietly time could continue if I stayed passive. The danger wasn't failure. The danger was repetition. I didn't want to wake up years later asking the same questions with heavier regret. I didn't want to look back and realize that awareness had come and I had ignored it. The shift inside me was subtle but firm. Regret had done its job. It had shown me the cost of waiting. Now it was time for agency. Agency didn't mean bold declarations or dramatic moves. It didn't mean rewriting my life overnight. It meant accepting that waiting was no longer neutral. It meant understanding that staying still was a decision, one I could choose differently. I thought about how often I had told myself I was waiting for the right moment, as if such a moment existed somewhere in the future, complete and risk-free. The truth was uncomfortable. The right moment had always been incomplete, messy, uncertain, and that had never stopped time from moving. I realized that my past self wasn't weak. They were cautious, and caution had kept me safe, but it had also kept me small. I breathed deeply, feeling the ground beneath my feet, the present moment anchoring me. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a distant concept. It felt like a direction. I wasn't obligated to change everything, but I was responsible for not pretending anymore. That responsibility felt heavy, but also empowering, because if waiting had been a choice, then choosing differently was possible. I didn't need confidence to act. Confidence could come after movement. I didn't need fear to disappear. Fear could come along with me. I didn't need permission. I could give it to myself. The question returned once more, quieter now. Will I still be here, waiting? This time, the answer formed clearly, not as a promise, but as a decision. No. Not because I was suddenly fearless, not because I knew exactly what to do next, but because I was no longer willing to let time decide for me. I finished my coffee slowly, savoring the taste instead of rushing through it. The small act felt symbolic, being present instead of postponing. The day ahead didn't look different from any other day. The responsibilities were the same, the structure unchanged, but something inside me had shifted. Regret no longer owned the narrative. I did. There was no shock in that realization, no dramatic turning point, just truth, steady, grounding, unavoidable. And that was enough to begin. Because once you stop pretending waiting is harmless, you can't unknow what it costs. And once you see that clearly, doing nothing is no longer the easiest choice. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't asking when life would begin. I was asking how I would show up for it. And that question, I knew, would keep me moving forward even when fear followed close behind.
Chapter 7. Choosing late is still choosing. The first step didn't feel brave. It felt awkward. I had imagined that choosing differently would come with clarity, some inner certainty that told me I was finally doing the right thing. Instead, what I felt was hesitation layered on top of fear, with a thin line of resolve holding it all together. I didn't wait for confidence. I acted without it. That was the first difference. The action itself was small, almost embarrassingly so. A decision I had delayed for years, reduced now to a simple step that didn't look impressive from the outside. There was no announcement, no one applauded, no one even noticed. But my hands shook as I did it. Fear followed me closely, just as it always had. It whispered the same warnings, the same doubts. You're too late. You should have done this years ago. What's the point now? The voice was familiar. I didn't argue with it. I didn't try to silence it. I let it speak. And then I moved anyway. That became the pattern. I stopped waiting to feel ready. I made choices while feeling uncertain, uncomfortable, and exposed. I accepted that fear wasn't a sign to stop. It was a sign that something mattered. Some days, the fear was loud. It made my chest tight and my thoughts restless. Other days, it faded into the background, present but manageable. What surprised me was what grew alongside it. Relief. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that feels like triumph or victory. A quiet relief. The kind that settles into your body when you stop lying to yourself. I noticed it in small moments, when I spoke honestly instead of offering a safe answer, when I said no without explaining myself, when I allowed myself to want something without immediately dismissing it. Each time there was a brief flash of discomfort, followed by a soft exhale I didn't realize I'd been holding. Starting late felt humiliating at first. I was painfully aware of how much time had passed, how far behind I felt compared to others, how inexperienced I was in areas I had avoided for years. There were moments when shame surfaced unexpectedly, when I wondered if it was foolish to begin something now when the excitement of beginning was tempered by the awareness of delay. I compared myself constantly to people who started earlier, to people who seemed more confident, to versions of myself that never existed. Those comparisons hurt. But I kept going, not because I suddenly believed in myself, but because stopping would have felt worse. I learned quickly that growth doesn't erase insecurity, it coexists with it. Some days I felt energized by the change. Other days I questioned everything. I worried I was making a mistake, that I had misunderstood the signal, that I would fail publicly and prove my fears right. I didn't feel empowered. I felt honest. And honesty, I was learning, had a steadier weight than motivation. The relief grew slowly, like something adjusting to light after a long time in the dark. It wasn't constant, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. I noticed how my body responded when I chose myself. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly, my breathing deepened. Sleep came easier on nights when I didn't betray my own needs. I began trusting small signals again, the quiet discomfort that told me something was off, the subtle pull towards something meaningful. I didn't rush to act on every feeling. I listened. That was new. I had spent so long overriding myself that listening felt unfamiliar. But the more I practiced, the clearer things became. Not easier, clearer. There were setbacks, days when I retreated into old patterns, when waiting felt tempting again, safe, comfortable. I didn't punish myself for those days. I acknowledged them. Choosing late didn't mean choosing perfectly. It meant choosing repeatedly. I realized that empowerment wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with confidence or certainty.
It showed up as persistence, as showing up again after doubt. There was no fantasy version of this process, no sudden transformation, no moment where fear disappeared and everything aligned. Just a series of small, deliberate decisions that slowly reshaped my relationship with myself. I stopped asking whether it was worth starting now. I started asking whether it was worth staying still. That shift changed everything. I began to see my past not as a failure, but as context. I understood why I had waited, why safety had mattered so much to me, why hesitation had once felt necessary. I didn't resent that version of myself anymore. I thanked them. They had kept me safe long enough for me to choose something else. The humiliation of starting late softened over time. It lost its sharp edges. It turned into humility, a quiet awareness that I was learning, imperfectly, honestly. That honesty felt grounding. I no longer needed to impress anyone. I wasn't trying to prove that I hadn't wasted time. I wasn't trying to catch up. I was just beginning. Some evenings, I reflected on how different this felt from the waiting I had lived in before. Waiting was passive, heavy, numbing. This was active, uncomfortable, alive. I wasn't rushing, I wasn't forcing momentum. I was moving, and movement, even slow movement, changed how time felt. Days became more distinct, moments carried weight again. I noticed things, my reactions, my preferences, my limits. I felt present in my own life in a way I hadn't in years. The fear never fully left, but it no longer decided for me. Starting late no longer felt like a weakness. It felt like truth. And truth, I was learning, had a steadier weight than confidence ever could be. Choosing late was still choosing. And choosing after all those years of waiting felt like the most honest thing I had ever done.
Chapter 8. I didn't miss my life. I delayed it. For a long time, I believed something had been taken from me. Time, opportunity, a version of life I was supposed to live. That belief carried quiet bitterness. It made me feel like a victim of circumstances, of responsibility, of choices that had been forced on me. It was easier to think life had slipped away without my consent. But as I stood where I was now, no longer waiting, no longer pretending, I began to see the truth more clearly. Life hadn't been stolen, it had been paused by me. That realization didn't come with shame. It came with calm. I thought back over the years I had spent waiting, and for the first time, I didn't judge them harshly. I saw them as they were. Years of learning how to survive, how to be careful, how to protect myself in a world that felt uncertain. Waiting had been my way of coping, and coping, I realized, wasn't the same as living, but it wasn't worthless either. Those years had taught me awareness. They taught me what silence feels like when it stretches too long. They taught me how easy it is to confuse safety with fulfillment. They taught me the cost of postponing your own voice. Most importantly, they taught me how deeply I wanted to come back. I used to think wasting time meant doing nothing. Now I understood it was more subtle than that. I hadn't wasted time by being idle. I had filled my days with activity, responsibility, and reason. I had shown up. I had contributed. I had endured. What I had done was delay. I delayed decisions that scared me. I delayed desires that felt inconvenient. I delayed myself. That distinction mattered, because delay can be reversed. You can't recover stolen time, but you can reclaim presence. You can choose differently once you see clearly. I noticed how different time felt now that I was moving, even slowly. Days no longer blurred together in the same way. They had texture again, weight, meaning. Not because everything was exciting or new, but because I was in it. I had stopped observing my life from a distance. I had stepped back inside. There were still ordinary days, quiet days, days where nothing remarkable happened. But even those days felt honest. They belonged to me. I no longer asked myself where all the time went. I knew it went where I put it. That understanding grounded me. It removed the illusion that life was something happening elsewhere, to other people, at a better time. Life was here. It always had been. I thought about the future not with urgency, not with pressure, but with steadiness. I didn't need to make up for lost years. I didn't need to rush to prove anything. I just needed to continue choosing presence over postponement. Some days, waiting still tempted me. Old habits don't disappear quietly. They remind you of comfort, of familiarity, of how easy it is to delay one more day. When that happened, I didn't panic. I recognized it. Waiting was no longer invisible to me. It no longer disguised itself as wisdom. I could see it for what it was, a choice. And that awareness was enough to keep me grounded. I began to appreciate something I had overlooked before. The years I spent waiting had sharpened my sense of what mattered. They made me sensitive to numbness, alert to quiet dissatisfaction, unwilling to ignore myself again. Awareness is not a small gift. It changes how you live. I didn't romanticize my past or regret it endlessly. I accepted it. I let it inform me instead of define me. Those years weren't lost. They were lessons I didn't know I was learning at the time. And now, standing on this side of waiting, I felt something settle into place. Peace. Not the kind that comes from certainty, the kind that comes from alignment. I was no longer divided between who I was and who I wanted to be. I was no longer waiting for permission to begin. Beginning had already happened, quietly, imperfectly, honestly. I looked at my life with clearer eyes and understood that fulfillment isn't about reclaiming everything you delayed. It's about showing up fully for what you choose now. The future didn't need to be dramatic. It needed to be present. I didn't miss my life. I delayed it. And delaying taught me how precious it feels to return. As I moved forward, I carried that understanding with me, not as regrets, but as wisdom, a steady reminder that time moves whether you act or not, but meaning comes from participation. I had spent years waiting, but I hadn't wasted the moment I finally began.